"Not so fast," answered Godfrey, whom the declaration of this modest bill of fare had put in good humor. "We need not risk indigestion to satisfy a fast. We must look after our reserves. Tartlet, take a couple of fowls, one apiece, and if we want bread, I hope that our camsa roots can be so prepared as to replace it with advantage." This cost the lives of 2 innocent hens who, plucked, trussed, and dressed by the professor, were stuck on a stick and soon roasted before the crackling flames. Meanwhile, Godfrey was getting the camas roots in a state to figure creditably at the first genuine breakfast on Fina Island. To render them edible, it was only necessary to follow the Indian method, which the Californians were well acquainted with. This was what Godfrey did. A few flat stones selected from the beach were thrown in the fire so as to get intensely hot. Tartlet seemed to think it a great shame to use such a good fire to cook stones with, but as it did not hinder the preparation of his fowls in any way, he had no other complaint to make. While the stones were getting warm, Godfrey selected a piece of ground about a yard square from which he tore up the grass. Then, with his hands armed with large scallop shells, he dug the soil to the depth of about 10 inches. That done, he laid at the bottom of the cavity a fire of dry wood, which he so arranged as to communicate to the earth heaped up at its bottom some considerable heat. When all the wood had been consumed and the cinders taken away, the camas roots, previously cleaned and scraped, were strewn in the hole, a thin layer of sods thrown over them, and the glowing stones placed on the top, so as to serve as the basis of a new fire which was lighted on their surface. In fact, it was a kind of oven which had been prepared, and in a very short time, about half an hour or so, the operation was at an end. Beneath the double layer of stones and sods lay the roots cooked by this violent heating. On crushing them, there was obtainable a flour well fitted for making into bread, but even eaten as they were, they proved much like potatoes of highly nutritive quality. It was thus that this time the roots were served, and we leave our readers to imagine what a breakfast our 2 friends made on the chickens, which they devoured to the very bones, and on the excellent camas roots, of which they had no need to be sparing. The field was not far off where they grew in abundance. They could be picked up in hundreds by simply stooping down for them. The repast over, Godfrey set to work to prepare some of the flour, which keeps for any length of time, and which could be transformed into bread for their daily wants. The day was passed in different occupations. The fire was kept up with great care. Particularly was the fuel heaped on for the night, and Tartlet, nevertheless, arose on many occasions to sweep the ashes together and provoke a more active combustion. Having done this, he would go to bed again, to get up as soon as the fire burnt low, and thus he occupied himself till the day broke. The night passed without incident. The cracklings of the fire and the crow of the cock awoke Godfrey and his companion, who had ended his performances by falling off to sleep. At first Godfrey was surprised at feeling a current of air coming down from above in the interior of Will Tree. He was thus led to think that the sequoia was hollow up to the junction of the lower branches, where there was an opening which they would have to stop up if they wished to be snug and sheltered. "But it is very singular," said Godfrey to himself. "How was it that during the preceding nights I did not feel this current of air? Could it have been the lightning?" And to get an answer to this question, the idea occurred to him to examine the trunk of the sequoia from the outside. When he had done so, he understood what had happened during the storm. The track of the lightning was visible on the tree, which had had a long strip of its bark torn off from the fork down to the roots. Had the electric spark found its way into the interior of the sequoia, in place of keeping to the outside, Godfrey and his companion would have been struck. Most decidedly, they had had a narrow escape. "It is not a good thing to take refuge under trees during a storm," said Godfrey. "That is all very well for people who can do otherwise, but what way have we to avoid the danger who live inside the tree? We must see." Then, examining the sequoia from the point where the long lightning trace began, "It is evident," said he, "that where the flash struck the tree has been cracked, but since the air penetrates by this orifice, The tree must be hollow along its whole length and only lives in its bark. Now that is what I ought to see about." And Godfrey went to look for a resinous piece of wood that might do for a torch. A bundle of pine twigs furnished him with the torch he needed, as from them exuded a resin which, once inflamed, gave forth a brilliant light. Godfrey then entered the cavity which served him for his house. To darkness immediately succeeded light, and it was easy to see the state of the interior of Will Tree. A sort of vault of irregular formation stretched across in a ceiling some 15 feet above the ground. Lifting his torch, Godfrey distinctly saw that into this there opened a narrow passage whose further development was lost in the shadow. The tree was evidently hollow throughout its length, but perhaps some portion of the alburnum still remained intact. In that case, by the help of the protuberances, it would be possible, if not easy, to get up to the fork. Godfrey, who was thinking of the future, resolved to know without delay if this were so. He had two ends in view: one, to securely close the opening by which the rain and wind found admission, and so render Will Tree almost habitable; the other, to see if in case of danger, or an attack from animals or savages, the upper branches of the tree would not afford a convenient refuge. He could but try. If he encountered any insurmountable obstacle in the narrow passage, Godfrey could be got down again. After firmly sticking his torch between two of the roots below, behold him then commencing to raise himself on to the first interior knots of the bark. He was lithe, strong, and accustomed to gymnastics like all young Americans. It was only sport to him. Soon he had reached in this uneven tube a part much narrower, in which, with the aid of his back and knees, he could work his way upwards like a chimney sweep. All he feared was that the hole would not continue large enough for him to get up. However, he kept on, and each time he reached a projection he would stop and take breath. 3 minutes after leaving the ground, Godfrey had mounted about 60 feet, and consequently could only have about 20 feet further to go. In fact, he already felt the air blowing more strongly on his face. He inhaled it greedily, for the atmosphere inside the sequoia was not, strictly speaking, particularly fresh. After resting for a minute, and shaking off the fine dust which he had rubbed onto him off the wall, Godfrey started again up the long tunnel, which gradually narrowed. But at this moment, his attention was attracted by a peculiar noise, which appeared to him somewhat suspicious. There was a sound as of scratching up the tree. Almost immediately a sort of hissing was heard. Godfrey stopped. "What is that?" he asked. "Some animal taken refuge in the sequoia? Was it a snake?" "No, we have not yet seen one on the island. Perhaps it is a bird that wants to get out." Godfrey was not mistaken, and as he continued to mount, a cawing, followed by a rapid flapping of wings, showed him that it was some bird ensconced in the tree whose sleep he was doubtless disturbing. Many a FRRR, which he gave out with the whole power of his lungs, soon determined the intruder to clear off. It proved to be a kind of jackdaw, of huge stature, which scuttled out of the opening and disappeared into the summit of Will Tree. A few seconds afterwards, Godfrey's head appeared through the same opening, and he soon found himself quite at his ease, installed on a fork of the tree where the lower branches gave off, at about 80 feet from the ground. There, as has been said, the enormous stem of the sequoia supported quite a forest. The capricious network of its upper boughs presented the aspect of a wood crowded with trees, which no gap rendered passable. However, Godfrey managed, not without difficulty, to get along from one branch to another, so as to gain little by little the upper story of this vegetable phenomenon. A number of birds, with many a cry, flew off at his approach, and hastened to take refuge in the neighboring members of the group, above which Will Tree towered by more than a head. Godfrey continued to climb as well as he could, and did not stop until the ends of the higher branches began to bend beneath his weight. A huge horizon of water surrounded Fina Island, which lay unrolled like a relief map at his feet. Greedily, his eyes examined that portion of the sea. It was still deserted. He had to conclude once more that the island lay away from the trade routes of the Pacific. Godfrey uttered a heavy sigh. Then his look fell on the narrow domain on which fate had condemned him to live, doubtless for long, perhaps forever. But what was his surprise when he saw, this time away to the north, a smoke similar to that which he had already thought he had seen in the south. He watched it with the keenest attention. There was the column of smoke. There was the column of smoke. A very light vapor, calm and pure, grayish-blue at its tip, rose straight in the air. "No, I am not mistaken," exclaimed Godfrey. "There is a smoke, and therefore a fire which produces it, and that fire could not have been lighted except by whom?" Godfrey then, with extreme precision, took the bearings of the spot in question. The smoke was rising in the northeast of the island, amid the high rocks which bordered the beach. There was no mistake about that. It was less than 5 miles from Wiltree, striking straight to the northeast across the prairie, and then following the shore, he could not fail to find the rocks above which the vapor rose. With beating heart, Godfrey made his way down the scaffolding of branches until he reached the fork. There he stopped an instant to clear off the moss and leaves which clung to him, and that done he slid down the opening, which he enlarged as much as possible, and rapidly gained the ground. A word to Tartlet not to be uneasy at his absence, and Godfrey hastened off in the northeasterly direction so as to reach the shore. It was a 2 hours' walk across the verdant prairie, through clumps of scattered trees or hedges of spiny shrubs, and then along the beach. At length the last chain of rocks was reached. But the smoke which Godfrey had seen from the top of the tree he searched for in vain when he had reached the ground. As he had taken the bearings of the spot with great care, he came towards it without any mistake. There Godfrey began his search. He carefully explored every nook and corner of this part of the shore. He called. No one answered to his shout. No human being appeared on the beach. Not a rock gave him a trace of a newly lighted fire, nor of a fire now extinct, which could have been fed by sea herbs and dry algae thrown up by the tide. "But it is impossible that I should have been mistaken," repeated Godfrey to himself. "I am sure it was smoke that I saw, and besides—" As Godfrey could not admit that he had been the dupe of a delusion, he began to think that there must exist some well of heated water or kind of intermittent geyser, which he could not exactly find, but which had given forth the vapor. There was nothing to show that in the island there were not many of such natural wells, and the apparition of the column of smoke could be easily explained by so simple a geological phenomenon. Godfrey left the shore and returned towards Wiltree, observing the country as he went along a little more carefully than he had done as he came. A few ruminants showed themselves, amongst others some wapiti, but they dashed past with such speed that it was impossible to get near them. In about 4 hours Godfrey got back. Just before he reached the tree he heard the shrill twang, squeak of the kit, and soon found himself face to face with Professor Tartlet, who, in the attitude of a vestal, was watching the sacred fire confided to his keeping. Chapter 14, wherein Godfrey finds some wreckage, to which he and his companion give a hearty welcome. To put up with what you cannot avoid is a philosophical principle that may not perhaps lead you to the accomplishment of great deeds, but is assuredly eminently practical. On this principle, Godfrey had resolved to act for the future. If he had to live in this island, the wisest thing for him to do was to live there as comfortably as possible until an opportunity offered for him to leave it. And so, without delay, he set to work to get the interior of Wiltree into some order. Cleanliness was of the first importance. The beds of dried grass were frequently renewed. The plates and dishes were only scallop shells, it is true, but no American kitchen could show cleaner ones. It should be said to his praise that Professor Tartlet was a capital washer. With the help of his knife, Godfrey, by flattening out a large piece of bark and sticking 4 uprights into the ground, had contrived a table in the middle of the room. Some large stumps served for stools. The comrades were no longer reduced to eating on their knees when the weather prevented their dining in the open air. There was still the question of clothing, which was of great interest to them, and they did the best they could. In that climate, and under that latitude, there was no reason why they should not go about half naked, but at length, trousers, waistcoat, and linen shirt were all worn out. How could they replace them? Were the sheep and the goats to provide them with skins for clothing, after furnishing them with flesh for food? It looked like it. Meanwhile, Godfrey had the few garments he possessed frequently washed. It was on Tartlet, transformed into a laundress, that this task fell, and he acquitted himself of it to the general satisfaction. Godfrey busied himself specially in providing food and in arranging matters generally. He was, in fact, the caterer. Collecting the edible roots and the manzanilla fruit occupied him some hours every day, and so did fishing with plaited rushes, sometimes in the waters of the stream, and sometimes in the hollows of the rocks on the beach when the tide had gone out. The means were primitive, no doubt, but from time to time a fine crustacean or a succulent fish figured on the table of Will Tree, to say nothing of the mollusks, which were easily caught by hand. We must confess that the pot, of all the pieces in the battery of the cook undoubtedly the most essential, the simple iron pot, was wanting. Its absence could not but be deeply felt. Godfrey knew not how to replace the vulgar pipkin, whose use is universal. No hash, no stew, no boiled meat, no fish, nothing but roasts and grills. No soup appeared at the beginning of a meal. Constantly and bitterly did Tartlet complain, but how to satisfy the poor man? Godfrey was busied with other cares. In visiting the different trees of the group, he had found a second sequoia of great height, of which the lower part, hollowed out by the weather, was very rugged and uneven. Here he devised his poultry house, and in it the fowls took up their abode. The hens soon became accustomed to their home, and settled themselves to set on eggs placed in the dried grass, and chickens began to multiply. Every evening the broods were driven in and shut up, so as to keep them from birds of prey, who, aloft in the branches, watched their easy victims, and would, if they could, have ended by destroying them. As for the agoutis, the sheep, and the goats, it would have been useless then to have looked out a stable or a shelter for them. When the bad weather came, there would be time enough to see to that. Meanwhile they prospered on the luxuriant pasturage of the prairie, with its abundance of sainfoin and edible roots, of which the porcine representatives showed genuine appreciation. A few kids had been dropped since the arrival in the island, and as much milk as possible was left to the goats, with which to nourish their little ones. From all this it resulted that the surroundings of Will Tree were quite lively. The well-fed domestic animals came during the warm hours of the day to find there a refuge from the heat of the sun. No fear was there of their wandering abroad, or of their falling a prey to wild beasts, of which Fina Island seemed to contain not a single specimen. And so things went on, with a present fairly comfortable perhaps, but a future very disquieting, when an unexpected incident occurred which bettered the position considerably. It was on the 29th of July. Godfrey was strolling in the morning along that part of the shore which formed the beach of the large bight to which he had given the name of Dream Bay. He was exploring it to see if it was as rich in shellfish as the coast on the north. Perhaps he still hoped that he might yet come across some of the wreck, of which it seemed to him so strange that the tide had as yet brought in not a single fragment. On this occasion, he had advanced to the northern point, which terminated in a sandy spit, when his attention was attracted by a rock of curious shape, rising near the last group of algae and seaweeds. A strange presentiment made him hasten his steps. What was his surprise and his joy when he saw that what he had taken for a rock was a box, half buried in the sand. Was it one of the packages of the Dream? Had it been here ever since the wreck? Was it not rather all that remained of another and more recent catastrophe? It was difficult to say. In any case, no matter whence it came or what it held, the box was a valuable prize. Godfrey examined it outwardly. There was no trace of an address, not even a name, not even one of those huge initials cut out of thin sheet metal which ornament the boxes of the Americans. Perhaps he would find inside it some paper which would indicate the origin or nationality or name of the proprietor. Anyhow, it was apparently hermetically sealed, and there was hope that its contents had not been spoiled by their sojourn in the seawater. It was a very strong wooden box, covered with thick leather, with copper corner plates at the angles and large straps all over it. Impatient as he was to view the contents of the box, Godfrey did not think of damaging it, but of opening it after destroying the lock. As to transporting it from the bottom of Dream Bay to Will Tree, its weight forbade it, and he never gave that a thought. "Well," said Godfrey to himself, "we must empty it where it is, and make as many journeys as may be necessary to take away all that is inside." It was about 4 miles from the end of the promontory to the group of sequoias. It would therefore take some time to do this, and occasion considerable fatigue. Time did not press, however. As for the fatigue, it was hardly worth thinking about. What did the box contain? Before returning to Will Tree, Godfrey had a try at opening it. He began by unbuckling the straps, and once they were off, he very carefully lifted the leather shield which protected the lock. But how was he to force it? It was a difficult job. Godfrey had no lever with which to bring his strength to bear. He had to guard against the risk of breaking his knife, and so he looked about for a heavy stone with which he could start the staple. The beach was strewn with lumps of hard silex in every form which could do for a hammer. Godfrey picked out one as thick as his wrist, and with it he gave a tremendous whack on the plate of copper. To his extreme surprise, the bolt shot through the staple immediately gave way. Either the staple was broken by the blow, or the lock was not turned. Godfrey's heart beat high as he stooped to lift up the box lid. It rose unchecked, and in truth, had Godfrey had to get it to pieces, he would not have done so without trouble. The trunk was a regular strongbox. The interior was lined with sheet zinc, so that the seawater had failed to penetrate. The objects it contained, however delicate they might be, would be found in a perfect state of preservation. And what objects? As he took them out, Godfrey could not restrain exclamations of joy. Most assuredly, the box must have belonged to some highly practical traveler who had reckoned on getting into a country where he would have to trust to his own resources. In the first place, there was linen, shirts, tablecloths, sheets, counterpanes, then clothes, woolen jerseys, woolen socks, cotton socks, cloth trousers, velveteen trousers, knitted waistcoats of good heavy stuffs, then 2 pairs of strong boots, and hunting shoes and felt hats. Then came a few kitchen and toilet utensils, and an iron pot, the famous pot which was wanted so badly, a kettle, a coffee pot, a teapot, some spoons, some forks, some knives, a looking-glass and brushes of all kinds, and what was by no means to be despised, 3 cans, containing about 15 pints of brandy and tafia, and several pounds of tea and coffee. Then in the third place came some tools, an auger, a gimlet, a handsaw, an assortment of nails and brads, a spade, a shovel, a pickaxe, a hatchet, an adze, and C&C. In the fourth place, there were some weapons, 2 hunting knives in their leather sheaths, a carbine and 2 muskets, 3 6-shooter revolvers, a dozen pounds of powder, many thousand caps, and an important stock of lead and bullets, all the arms seeming to be of English make. There was also a small medicine chest, a telescope, a compass, and a chronometer. There were also a few English books, several quires of blank paper, pencils, pens, and ink, an almanac, a Bible with a New York imprint, and a complete cook's manual. Verily, this is an inventory of what, under the circumstances, was an inestimable prize. Godfrey could not contain himself for joy. Had he expressly ordered the trousseau for the use of shipwrecked folks in difficulties, he could not have made it more complete. Abundant thanks were due for it to Providence, and Providence had the thanks, and from an overflowing heart. Godfrey indulged himself in the pleasure of spreading out all his treasure on the beach. Every object was looked over, but not a scrap of paper was there in the box to indicate to whom it belonged or the ship on which it had been embarked. Around, the sea showed no signs of a recent wreck. Nothing was there on the rocks, nothing on the sands. The box must have been brought in by the flood after being afloat for perhaps many days. In fact, its size in proportion to its weight had assured for it sufficient buoyancy. The two inhabitants of Fina Island would for some time be kept provided in a large measure with the material wants of life, tools, arms, instruments, utensils, clothes, due to the luckiest of chances. Godfrey did not dream of taking all the things to Wiltree at once. Their transport would necessitate several journeys, but he would have to make haste for fear of bad weather. Godfrey then put back most of the things in the box: a gun, a revolver, a certain quantity of powder and lead, a hunting knife, the telescope, and the iron pot he took as his first load. The box was carefully closed and strapped up, and with a rapid step, Godfrey strode back along the shore. Ah, what a reception he had from Tartlet an hour later, and the delight of the professor when his pupil ran over the list of their new riches. The pot, that pot above everything, threw him into transports of joy, culminating in a series of hornpipes and cellar flaps, wound up by a triumphant 6/8 breakdown. It was only noon as yet. Godfrey wished after the meal to get back at once to Dream Bay. He would never rest until the whole was in safety at Wiltree. Tartlet made no objection and declared himself ready to start. It was no longer necessary to watch the fire. With the powder, they could always get a light. But the professor was desirous that during their absence, the soup which he was thinking about might be kept gently on the simmer. The wonderful pot was soon filled with water from the stream. A whole quarter of a goat was thrown in, accompanied by a dozen yamf roots, to take the place of vegetables, and then a pinch or two of salt found in the crevices of the rocks gave seasoning to the mixture. "It must skim itself," exclaimed Tartlet, who seemed highly satisfied at his performance. And off they started for Dream Bay by the shortest road. The box had not been disturbed. Godfrey opened it with care. Amid a storm of admiring exclamations from Tartlet, he began to pick out the things. In this first journey, Godfrey and his companion, transformed into beasts of burden, carried away to Wiltree the arms, the ammunition, and a part of the wearing apparel. Then they rested from their fatigue beside the table, on which there smoked the stewed agouti, which they pronounced most excellent. As for the meat, to listen to the professor, it would have been difficult even to imagine anything more exquisite. Oh, the marvelous effect of privation! On the 30th, the next day, Godfrey and Tartlet set forth at dawn, and in 3 other journeys succeeded in emptying and carrying away all that the box contained. Before the evening, tools, weapons, instruments, utensils were all brought, arranged, and stowed away in Wiltree. On the 1st of August, the box itself, dragged along the beach not without difficulty, found a place in the tree and was transformed into a linen closet. Tartlet, with the fickleness of his mind, now looked upon the future through none but rosy glasses. We can hardly feel astonished then that on this day, with his kit in his hand, he went out to find his pupil, and said to him in all seriousness, as if he were in the drawing-room of Colderup's mansion, "Well, Godfrey, my boy, don't you think it is time to resume our dancing lessons?" Chapter 15, in which there happens what happens at least once in the life of every Crusoe, real or imaginary. And now the future looked less gloomy, but if Tartlet saw in the possession of the instruments, the tools, and the weapons only the means of making their life of isolation a little more agreeable, Godfrey was already thinking of how to escape from Fina Island. Could he not now construct a vessel strong enough to enable them to reach, if not some neighboring land, at least some ship passing within sight of the island? Meanwhile, the weeks which followed were principally spent in carrying out not these ideas, but those of Tartlet. The wardrobe at Wiltree was now replenished, but it was decided to use it with all the discretion which the uncertainty of the future required. Never to wear any of the clothes, unless necessity compelled him to do so, was the rule to which the professor was forced to submit. "What is the good of that?" grumbled he. "It is a great deal too stingy, my dear Godfrey. Are we savages that we should go about half-naked?" "I beg your pardon, Tartlet," replied Godfrey. "We are savages and nothing else." "As you please, but you will see that we shall leave the island before we have worn the clothes." "I know nothing about it, Tartlet, and it is better to have than to want." But on Sunday now, surely on Sunday, we might dress up a little. Very well, on Sundays then, and perhaps on public holidays, answered Godfrey, who did not wish to anger his frivolous companion. But as today is Monday, we shall have to wait a whole week before we come out in our best. We need hardly mention that from the moment he arrived on the island, Godfrey had not omitted to mark each day as it passed. By the aid of the calendar he found in the box, he was able to verify that the day was really Monday. Each performed his daily task according to his ability. It was no longer necessary for them to keep watch by day and night over a fire which they had now the means of relighting. Tartlet therefore abandoned, not without regret, a task which suited him so well. Henceforwards he took charge of the provisioning with yamf and camas roots, of that in short which formed the daily bread of the establishment, so that the professor went every day and collected them, up to the lines of shrubs with which the prairie was bordered behind Will Tree. It was 1 or 2 miles to walk, but he accustomed himself to it. Between whiles, he occupied his time in collecting oysters or other mollusks, of which they consumed a great quantity. Godfrey reserved for himself the care of the domestic animals and the poultry. The butchering trade was hardly to his taste, but he soon overcame his repugnance. Thanks to him, boiled meats appeared frequently on the table, followed by an occasional joint of roast meat to afford a sufficiently varied bill of fare. Game abounded in the woods of Fina Island, and Godfrey proposed to begin his shooting when other more pressing cares allowed him time. He thought of making good use of the guns, powder, and bullets in his arsenal, but he in the first place wished to complete his preparations. His tools enabled him to make several benches inside and outside Will Tree. The stools were cut out roughly with the axe. The table, made a little less roughly, became more worthy of the dishes and dinner things with which Professor Tartlet adorned it. The beds were arranged in wooden boxes, and their litter of dry grass assumed a more inviting aspect. If mattresses and palliasses were still wanting, counterpanes at least were not. The various cooking utensils stood no longer on the ground, but had their places on planks fixed along the walls. Stores, linen, and clothes were carefully put away in cavities hollowed out in the bark of the sequoia. From strong pegs were suspended the arms and instruments, forming quite a trophy on the walls. Godfrey was also desirous of putting a door to the house, so that the other living creatures, the domestic animals, should not come during the night and trouble their sleep. As he could not cut out boards with his only saw, the handsaw, he used large and thick pieces of bark, which he got off very easily. With these he made a door sufficiently massive to close the opening into Will Tree. At the same time he made 2 little windows, one opposite to the other, so as to let light and air into the room. Shutters allowed him to close them at night, but from the morning to the evening it was no longer necessary to take refuge in flaring resinous torches which filled the dwelling with smoke. What Godfrey would think of to yield them light during the long nights of winter he had as yet no idea. He might take to making candles with the mutton fat, or he might be contented with resinous torches more carefully prepared. We shall see. Another of his anxieties was how to construct a chimney in Will Tree. While the fine weather lasted, the fire outside among the roots of the sequoia sufficed for all the wants of the kitchen, but when the bad weather came and the rain fell in torrents, and they would have to battle with the cold, whose extreme rigor during a certain time they reasonably feared, they would have to have a fire inside their house, and the smoke from it must have some vent. This important question, therefore, had to be settled. One very useful work, which Godfrey undertook, was to put both banks of the river in communication with each other on the skirt of the sequoia trees. He managed, after some difficulty, to drive a few stakes into the riverbed, and on them he fixed a staging of planks, which served for a bridge. They could thus get away to the northern shore without crossing the ford, which led them a couple of miles out of their road. But if Godfrey took all these precautions so as to make existence a little more possible on this lone isle of the Pacific, in case he and his companion were destined to live on it for some time, or perhaps live on it forever, he had no intention of neglecting in any way the chances of rescue. Fina Island was not on the routes taken by the ships. That was only too evident. It offered no port of call, nor means of revictualling. There was nothing to encourage ships to take notice of it. At the same time, it was not impossible that a warship or a merchant vessel might come in sight. It was advisable, therefore, to find some way of attracting attention and showing that the island was inhabited. With this object, Godfrey erected a flagstaff at the end of the cape, which ran out to the north, and for a flag he sacrificed a piece of one of the cloths found in the trunk. As he thought that the white color would only be visible in a strong light, he tried to stain his flag with the berries of a sort of shrub which grew at the foot of the dunes. He obtained a very vivid red, which he could not make indelible owing to his having no mordant, but he could easily redye the cloth when the wind or rain had faded it. These varied employments occupied him up to the 15th of August. For many weeks, the sky had been constantly clear, with the exception of 2 or 3 storms of extreme violence which had brought down a large quantity of water to be greedily drunk in by the soil. About this time, Godfrey began his shooting expeditions, but if he was skillful enough in the use of the gun, he could not reckon on Tartlet, who had yet to fire his first shot. Many days of the week did Godfrey devote to the pursuit of fur and feather, which, without being abundant, were yet plentiful enough for the requirements of Will Tree. A few partridges, some of the red-legged variety, and a few snipes came as a welcome variation of the bill of fare. 2 or 3 antelopes fell to the prowess of the young stalker, and although he had had nothing to do with their capture, the professor gave them a no less welcome than he did when they appeared as haunches and cutlets. But while he was out shooting, Godfrey did not forget to take a more complete survey of the island. He penetrated the depths of the dense forests which occupied the central districts. He ascended the river to its source. He again mounted the summit of the cone and redescended by the talus on the eastern shore, which he had not, up to then, visited. After all these explorations, repeated Godfrey to himself, there can be no doubt that Fina Island has no dangerous animals, neither wild beasts, snakes, nor saurians. I have not caught sight of one. Assuredly, if there had been any, the report of the gun would have woke them up. It is fortunate, indeed. If it were to become necessary to fortify Will Tree against their attacks, I do not know how we should get on. Then passing on to quite a natural deduction. It must also be concluded, continued he, that the island is not inhabited at all. Either natives or people shipwrecked here would have appeared before now at the sound of the gun. There is, however, that inexplicable smoke which I twice thought I saw. The fact is that Godfrey had never been able to trace any fire. As for the hot water springs to which he attributed the origin of the vapor he had noticed, Fina Island, being in no way volcanic, did not appear to contain any, and he had to content himself with thinking that he had twice been the victim of an illusion. Besides, this apparition of the smoke or the vapor was not repeated. When Godfrey the second time ascended the central cone, as also when he again climbed up into Will Tree, he saw nothing to attract his attention. He ended by forgetting the circumstance altogether. Many weeks passed in different occupations about the tree, and many shooting excursions were undertaken. With every day, their mode of life improved. Every Sunday, as had been agreed, Tartlet donned his best clothes. On that day he did nothing but walk about under the big trees and indulge in an occasional tune on the kit. Many were the glissades he performed, giving lessons to himself, as his pupil had positively refused to continue his course. "What is the good of it?" was Godfrey's answer to the entreaties of the professor. "Can you imagine Robinson Crusoe taking lessons in dancing and deportment?" "And why not?" asked Tartlet seriously. "Why should Robinson Crusoe dispense with deportment? Not for the good of others, but of himself, he should acquire refined manners." To which Godfrey made no reply, and as he never came for his lesson, the professor became Professor Emeritus. The 13th of September was noted for one of the greatest and cruelest deceptions to which, on a desert island, the unfortunate survivors of a shipwreck could be subjected. Godfrey had never again seen that inexplicable and undiscoverable smoke on the island, but on this day, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, his attention was attracted by a long line of vapor, about the origin of which he could not be deceived. He had gone for a walk to the end of Flag Point, the name which he had given to the cape on which he had erected his flagstaff. While he was looking through his glass, he saw above the horizon a smoke driven by the west wind towards the island. Godfrey's heart beat high. "A ship!" he exclaimed. But would this ship, this steamer, pass in sight of Fina Island? And if it passed, would it come near enough for the signal thereon to be seen on board? Or would not rather the semi-visible smoke disappear with the vessel towards the northwest or southwest of the horizon? For 2 hours, Godfrey was a prey to alternating emotions more easy to indicate than to describe. The smoke got bigger and bigger. It increased when the steamer restoked her fires and diminished almost to vanishing point as the fuel was consumed. Continually did the vessel visibly approach. About 4 o'clock her hull had come up on the line between the sky and the sea. She was a large steamer bearing northeast. Godfrey easily made that out. If that direction was maintained, she would inevitably approach Fina Island. Godfrey had at first thought of running back to Wiltree to inform Tartlet. What was the use of doing so? The sight of one man making signals could do as much good as that of two. He remained there, his glass at his eye, losing not a single movement of the ship. The steamer kept on her course towards the coast, her bow steered straight for the Cape. By 5 o'clock, the horizon line was already above her hull, and her rig was visible. Godfrey could even recognize the colors at her gaff. She carried the United States ensign. But if I can see their flag, cannot they see mine? The wind keeps it out, so that they could easily see my flag with their glasses. Shall I make signals by raising it and lowering it a few times, so as to show that I want to enter into communication with them? Yes, I have not an instant to lose. It was a good idea. Godfrey ran to the end of Flag Point and began to haul his flag up and down as if he were saluting. Then he left it half-mast high so as to show, in the way usual with seafaring people, that he required help and succor. The steamer still approached to within 3 miles of the shore, but her flag remained immovable at the peak and replied not to that on Flag Point. Godfrey felt his heart sink. He would not be noticed. It was 6:30, and the sun was about to set. The steamer was now about 2 miles from the Cape, which she was rapidly nearing. At this moment, the sun disappeared below the horizon. With the first shadows of night, all hope of being seen had to be given up. Godfrey again, with no more success, began to raise and lower his flag. There was no reply. He then fired his gun 2 or 3 times, but the distance was still great, and the wind did not set in that direction. No report would be heard on board. The night gradually came on. Soon the steamer's hull grew invisible. Doubtless, in another hour, she would have passed Fina Island. Godfrey, not knowing what to do, thought of setting fire to a group of resinous trees which grew at the back of Flag Point. He lighted a heap of dry leaves with some gunpowder, and then set light to the group of pines, which flared up like an enormous torch. But no fire on the ship answered to the one on the land, and Godfrey returned sadly to Wiltree, feeling perhaps more desolate than he had ever felt till then. Chapter 16, in which something happens which cannot fail to surprise the reader. To Godfrey the blow was serious. Would this unexpected chance which had just escaped him ever offer again? Could he hope so? No. The indifference of the steamer as she passed in sight of the island, without even taking a look at it, was obviously shared in by all the vessels venturing in this deserted portion of the Pacific. Why should they put into port more than she had done? The island did not possess a single harbor. Godfrey passed a sorrowful night. Every now and then jumping up as if he heard a cannon out at sea, he would ask himself if the steamer had not caught sight of the huge fire which still burnt on the coast, and if she were not endeavoring to answer the signal by a gunshot. Godfrey listened. It was only an illusion of his overexcited brain. When the day came, he had come to look upon the apparition of the ship as but a dream, which had commenced about 3 o'clock on the previous afternoon. But no, he was only too certain that a ship had been in sight of Fina Island, maybe within 2 miles of it, and certainly she had not put in.